Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into uh, the mandate for Palestine.
Woo!
Yeah. This is a really important historical document, and it really shaped the political and social landscape
It did.
of the Middle East and the region, and really has been a factor in the ongoing uh, Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this deep dive is going to be guided by excerpts from Wikipedia articles on the mandate for Palestine and mandatory Palestine.
Okay.
So those are our sources.
All right, sounds good.
This is, like I said, this is a really important topic, and I think to really understand what's going on today, we need to go back in time.
Yeah, we have to set the stage right.
Exactly. So maybe you can start us off by, giving us a little bit of the historical background.
Sure. So the mandate for Palestine didn't just kind of appear out of nowhere. It really comes out of
Out of the chaos.
of World War I.
Exactly.
And Britain had kind of made a series of promises to different groups leading up to and during World War I with different interests in the Middle East.
Yeah, it sounds like they were trying to play both sides and
Trying to make everyone happy.
yeah,
It doesn't always work.
and it rarely does.
No, it rarely does.
So what were some of these promises that they were making?
Yeah, so you have one of the most famous ones is the Balfour Declaration of 1917, where Britain pledged support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Okay, so this obviously, is a huge deal for the Zionist movement.
Yeah,
But at the same time, they were also corresponding with the Arabs and kind of making promises of independence.
right, yeah. So that's the McMahon-Hussein correspondence that happened between 1915 and 1916, and in that, Britain implies support for Arab independence in a vast territory, potentially including Palestine.
Okay, so we got two promises here that seem kind of impossible to reconcile.
Yeah, and to add to that, you have a secret agreement that was made between Britain and France.
Ooh, a secret agreement.
A secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916.
All right.
And in this agreement, they agreed to divide the Ottoman Middle East between them. And according to this, Palestine was supposed to be under international administration.
So we've got, public promises, we've got secret agreements, we've got all these different groups with their own agendas. It's a very complicated situation.
It's a very messy situation, so it's not really a surprise that it led to some problems down the road.
Yeah, so how did Britain actually end up in control of Palestine? Like, what was the mechanism for that?
So it happened in two stages.
Okay.
So in 1919, France kind of privately ceded Palestine to Great Britain.
Okay.
And then the San Remo Conference in 1920 formally assigned the mandate to Great Britain.
Okay.
And they were, kind of legitimizing this by citing Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant.
Right, which was supposed to guide these territories towards independence.
Exactly. It
Okay,
was,
okay.
So there's already all this, these political machinations happening behind the scenes, right? It's all very, very complicated.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that Transjordan also became part of this mandate.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
That's kind of a whole other story.
Yeah.
So Transjordan wasn't initially part of the plan, but in 1921, Abdullah, the brother of the deposed King Faisal of Syria, occupied Transjordan.
Just occupied it.
Just occupied it.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And Britain decided to incorporate it into the mandate for Palestine, but with a slight change.
Okay.
They decided that Transjordan was going to be administered separately.
Okay.
So it was still part of the mandate for Palestine, but it was going to have its own government,
Yeah.
and it would be exempt from some of the provisions relating to Jewish settlement.
Okay, so it's kind of like a mandate within a mandate.
It is, exactly.
Very interesting. And so they installed Abdullah as the emir.
As the emir of Transjordan, yes.
So all of this is happening, kind of organically and through these political deals and this kind of thing. Were the people who were living in Palestine, were they involved in any of this?
No. So that's one of the big problems with the mandate. The Arab population, which was the majority population in Palestine, was completely excluded from the decision-making process.
And, we talked about how they had already been making these promises to the Arabs about independence.
Right.
And yet they're not even included in these discussions about what's going to happen to their land.
Exactly. And that really sets the stage for a lot of the conflict that's going to come later on.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they're kind of setting themselves up for failure here.
Yeah, it's not a great start.
Not a great start, no. Okay, so this is really fascinating. We've kind of set the stage. We've seen how Britain ended up in control. We've seen how Transjordan got added to the mix. But we haven't even gotten to the actual document itself.
Right, the mandate itself.
So that's what we're going to do in part 2.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Mandate for Palestine. Last time we were talking about how Britain ended up in control of Palestine and
How they kind of added Transjordan to the mix.
Yeah.
Almost as an afterthought.
As an afterthought, yeah. And we were also talking about how the Arab population was completely excluded from all of these decisions, yeah.
It's a very top-down approach
Yeah.
to governing.
And that brings us to the actual drafting of the mandate itself, which unfortunately followed a similar pattern.
So they didn't learn their lesson.
They didn't really learn their lesson.
From the previous.
Exactly. Even though the Arabs were already voicing their opposition to the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine, they were still excluded from the drafting of the mandate.
Wow, so they're just ignoring this, huge potential source of conflict?
Basically, yeah. They were really operating under the assumption that they knew what was best for the region.
And spoiler alert, they didn't.
They didn't.
Okay, so let's talk about the mandate itself. What were some of the key issues and controversies that emerged from this document?
Well, one of the biggest ones was the whole idea of a national home for the Jewish people.
Right, this is the central...
This is the crux of the issue.
Yeah. And this is language that comes directly from the Balfour Declaration.
Exactly.
But the mandate doesn't really clarify what that means in practice.
No, it really doesn't. And, this lack of clarity led to very different interpretations from both sides.
Yeah.
So the Jewish groups saw this as a green light to establish a Jewish state in Palestine.
Right.
Whereas the Arab population saw this as, a direct threat to their own future in Palestine.
It's like they planted a time bomb with that phrase.
Yeah, and it just kind of exploded later on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was also a lot of controversy about the borders.
Yeah?
Right?
Oh, yeah. The borders were a mess.
Yeah, we talked about how Transjordan was kind of, just added into the mandate.
Kind of tacked on.
Yeah. But the borders were very poorly defined.
Yeah. And once again, the Arab population had no say in this process.
Oh, so it's the same problem again?
Same problem again. And as the borders were kind of negotiated and eventually solidified, they differed from earlier proposals.
So people didn't really know where they stood?
They didn't really know
what was going to happen.
what was going to happen, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, it's not surprising that given all of this, the vague wording, the confusing borders, the exclusion of the Arabs, it's not surprising that there was a lot of Arab opposition to the mandate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They were not happy about the situation at all.
So how did this opposition manifest itself?
Well, they started to organize themselves politically.
Okay.
So they formed groups like the Palestine Arab Congress in 1919
Okay.
to try to advocate for their interests.
Okay, so they were trying to work within the system to get their voices heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, they also faced a lot of obstacles.
I can imagine.
For example, in 1923, Britain proposed the creation of a legislative council,
Okay.
which was supposed to be a step towards self-government.
That sounds like a good thing.
It sounds like a good thing.
Yeah.
But the Arabs rejected it
Why?
because they saw it as a way to legitimize the mandate,
Oh, okay.
which they were opposed to.
Right.
So they didn't want to participate in a system that they felt was fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if you don't have a seat at the table.
You're on the menu.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this opposition, eventually boiled over into violence.
Yeah, unfortunately, the mounting frustration and anger among the Palestinian Arabs eventually led to revolts and uprising.
Yeah, the big one being the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939.
Exactly. That was a major turning point.
And this is really a demonstration of how deeply opposed they were to the mandate.
Exactly.
And to, the whole idea of, Jewish immigration and this kind of thing.
They saw it as a threat to their own future.
Yeah. Yeah, and these revolts were ultimately unsuccessful, but they had a huge impact.
They did, yeah. They resulted in a lot of violence and bloodshed.
Yeah.
And they really just deepened the divide between the two communities.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm.
The more they resist,
The worse it gets.
the worse it gets. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the politics, we've talked about the borders, we've talked about the Arab resistance, but what was life actually like for people living under the mandate?
Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so stay tuned. All right, so we're back, and we're really going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty now,
Yeah, the human side of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was it like for people actually living?
Day.
Yeah, day to day under this mandate.
Yeah, so you can imagine it was a very tense and uncertain time.
Yeah.
You had a significant influx of Jewish immigrants,
Right.
primarily from Europe. And they were coming to Palestine to, build a new life.
Yeah, driven by this, Zionist dream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you had the Arab population who were already there.
Right, who have been there for centuries.
For centuries.
Yeah.
And they obviously had their own, culture and traditions and way of life.
So you've got these two groups with, very different goals.
Yeah.
Kind of competing for the same resources.
Yeah, and it led to a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Especially over things like land.
Yeah.
The Jewish immigrants were buying land from absentee Arab landlords.
Right.
And this was leading to displacement of Arab tenant farmers.
And this is creating a lot of resentment, obviously.
A lot of resentment, yeah.
Yeah.
And, to make matters worse, the British administration was often perceived as favoring Jewish interests.
Right.
They were implementing policies that facilitated Jewish immigration and land acquisition.
So it's almost like they were fulfilling the mandate
In a way, yeah.
to the letter.
Yeah, they were.
But it's at the expense of the Arab population.
Right. It's like they were trying to balance these two competing claims, but they weren't doing a very good job of it.
Yeah. It seems like they were making things worse in some way.
They were definitely exacerbating the tensions.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the social and political dynamics, but what about the legal system? Like, how did that work?
So the British basically imposed their own legal system on Palestine.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
They're in charge.
But they also had to accommodate the existing religious courts.
Oh, right. Because you have both the Jewish and the Muslim communities with their own religious laws.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it was kind of a hybrid system,
Yeah.
a mix of British law and religious law.
Okay, so this mandate obviously couldn't last forever.
No.
So how did it end?
Well, World War II had a big impact on the situation.
Okay.
The horrors of the Holocaust really strengthened the resolve of the Zionist movement.
No, they felt like they needed a Jewish state now more than ever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Britain was exhausted from the war.
Yeah.
And they were facing increasing pressure to find a solution to the Palestine problem.
I mean, it sounds like they had created a real mess.
They had. So in 1947, they announced their intention to withdraw from Palestine.
Okay.
And they handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations.
So the UN is now in charge of trying to figure this out.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they came up with the partition plan,
Right.
which proposed dividing Palestine into two states.
One Jewish, one Arab.
One Jewish, one Arab, yeah.
Yeah.
But this plan was rejected by the Arab leadership.
Of course.
And it ultimately led to war.
Yeah, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is really where we see the legacy of the mandate. All of the problems that were created by the mandate
Right.
really came to a head.
They all exploded. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really tragic story.
It is. Yeah.
And it's one that, unfortunately continues to this day.
Yeah, the conflict is still ongoing.
Yeah. But I think, by understanding the history of the mandate, we can maybe start to see a path towards a more peaceful future.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Really appreciate your insights. My pleasure.
And for those of you listening, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.